Hey guys, so I am actually sitting out in my car right now in order to record this lecture because Mrs. Johnson is teaching ASL in our classroom and I have to get it done before lab today, so this is my only shot. So here I am sitting in my car and I'm going to tell you all about cultural patterns and diffusion today. Hopefully this will be quick, although I have learned that I have a tendency to be long-winded, so I apologize if it goes longer than it should. I will try to get through the material quickly. And then as we're going through, if anything doesn't make sense or you need to review it again, jot down a question and we can go over stuff on Monday, okay? All right, here we go. This is 3.3, cultural patterns. The big idea is that cultural practices vary across geological locations because of physical geography and available resources. And our goal today is to be able to explain patterns and landscapes of language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Okay, so we're going to hit those four things right now. This is just a quick review from last time about cultural landscape. You guys you should be doing some time today finishing up that cultural landscape activity that we started last time. So this might help with that as well. So remember that a cultural landscape is patterns and landscapes of language, religion, and ethnicity that contribute to a sense of place, enhance placemaking, and shape the global cultural landscape. Cultural factors such as language, ethnicity, and religion can be centripetal or centrifugal forces. Now, a centripetal force, this is, let me find the right pen that I want to use. A centripetal force is anything that helps unify a country. It provides stability, it brings people together, things like shared holidays, national holidays, like patriotic songs that we all know. Veterans Day coming up would be one of those centripetal forces. Common language, common religion, things that help bring people together or that people have in common and share that will unify them, okay? Centrifugal forces are exactly the opposite. Centrifugal forces are characteristics that cause division in a country. They are destabilizing. So this would be where if there are multiple competing ethnicities within a country and they can't seem to get along, if there are competing political groups or parties that can't seem to get along, different religions, all of these things can create, tension, which would then impact the stability of the country. Now you can see over on this part of the screen, the top map is a map of the Spanish language, okay? So we have the Spanish language that originated over here in Spain, and then through colonial and imperial efforts, Spain colonized most of the Central and South America, okay? So Spanish is now spoken all down this way. What is most interesting about this that a lot of people don't realize is that if you look specifically in Spain, there are multiple languages that are spoken in Spain. So here, oh wait, hold on. This is the wrong map. I apologize. This is actually a map of Nigeria instead of a map of Spain. I apologize. But the same concept holds. So in Nigeria, you have probably a dozen or more different language groups, which would then result in language being a destabilizing factor, one of these centrifugal forces over here, because people don't share it. They don't have it in common. It makes communication, it makes negotiation, it makes compromise difficult because you can't understand each other. Now, with Spain specifically, what I thought my map was, Spain actually has a couple of very strong subgroups, different ethnicities than the majority Spanish. Catalonia and the Basque both are located within the country of Spain, but they have different languages and are very particular in maintaining those cultural differences, which actually can be a destabilizing factor, even though Spanish as a language is spoken so widely outside of Spain. Within Spain, it's not the only language. Go figure. Regional patterns for language. So this is a map that comes straight from your book, pages 150 to 151. The thing that I want you to notice first is that language and region tend to coincide, right? So Arabic, Middle East. What is that one? The Niger, Congo, southern part of Africa south of the Sahara. You've got Sino-Tibetan over here in China. You've got the Altaic up here in Central Asia. And then most everywhere else, you have this one right here. If you can't read it, it is the Indo-European. Okay, Indo-European is everywhere on the map that looks white. In your book, it looks sort of like a creamy color, but it didn't translate to my electronic map. Anything that results from Europe, all of those languages that are tied back to the ancient history of Europe is referred to or is part of the Indo-European language family, which is the most widely spoken language family in the world. Indo-European. It's also the most prolific, meaning it covers the most actual land, okay? All through most of Europe, all through most of Russia, all through most of North America, and even into parts of South America as well, you have Indo-European languages. The second largest one is this one right here. Sino-Tibetan is what it's called. Now, if you look, it's not nearly as prolific as Indo-European. It only covers a small area, specifically China and parts of Southeast Asia. But the Sino-Tibetan is the second largest because of the number of speakers. Okay. So Indo-European is the biggest because it has the most speakers, but it also has the most land covered. Sino-Tibetan is second because of the number of speakers. It has the second most number of speakers in that language family. Okay. There are lots of other language families. We cover them in the book. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on them in class. As long as you know these two, Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan, you should be good to go. But you can see the prevalence as you look at the map in distinct language families. Now remember, these are language families. Underneath the language families, you have language groups, language branches, and then individual languages. Some of these language families have dozens of languages that fit underneath them, okay? So don't think that, this Sino-Tibetan is one language. It is certainly not. And Indo-European, obviously, that's going to cover English, Spanish, Italian, French, German, Russian, all of those, okay? All right, move to religion. Regional patterns of religion. There are four big religions. The big four are Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and then the last one is Hinduism. It's important to note there's two kind of categories of religions, universal or universalizing and ethnic. So these three are universalizing. Hinduism is actually an ethnic religion. Universalizing religions are religions that are found worldwide, and they are religions where there is an active attempt to proselyte, to get new members to join their religion. Hinduism and other ethnic religions are very localized to a certain area of the world, and they don't really seek to add new members. Hinduism is the fourth largest religion, despite the fact that it doesn't seek for new members, specifically because of the number of followers. So we're looking in the billions with these. Hinduism, Christianity is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 billion people. Buddhism and Islam are both about 1 billion. Hinduism is about 500 million people who follow. Okay. If you look as far as prevalence and prolific nature of religions, you will see the gold, kind of orangish, yellowish color is Christianity. North America, South America, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Russia, Australia, all predominantly Christian. The predominant areas of Islam include North Africa, what we would call the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and even into Central Asia. Buddhism, we find specifically in Southeast Asia, up into Mongolia as well. Interesting that China is not affiliated. The reason China is not given a religious affiliation is because of China's government. They are a communist government, which I realize you guys probably know. One of the things you may not realize is that communism actually strongly discourages any practicing of religion. Communism, part of its philosophy is that it wants, the members of their society, the members of their country, to rely on the government, to rely on the state. They don't want anyone to rely on anything else. No faith, no God, no, other members of their religion that they can go to for support. They want all of that strength and support to come specifically from the state. And so they strongly discourage the practicing of any religion, which is why you don't see one in China. Japan is not communist, but they have progressed far enough through the DTM, which you do see some correlations, as well as just their culture and their society itself. Religion, while it exists, and you do see evidence specifically of Buddhism and Confucianism, you don't really see it practiced very widely, and certainly not like on a weekly or even monthly basis. And so they just are a little bit more what we would refer to as agnostic. They don't necessarily, believe that there isn't a God, but they don't really have a specific way that they worship. You can see that the majority of the world is Christian. The second largest, obviously, especially from actual physical geography, space taking up land point of view, Islam is second, Buddhism is third. Now realize this is Buddhism, and yet as far as land goes, it's very small, not a whole lot of territory covered by the Buddhists, and yet lots and lots of people. Okay, high population density in this region of the world. And so while it may not cover a lot of territory, it has a lot of followers. And then Hinduism here in India. Okay. This is ethnicity. We're going to talk about ethnicity specifically right now as it pertains in the United States. You'll notice the 4 maps. If I were to ask you to guess which ethnicity each map represented, you would probably do an okay job, especially with 1 and 2. They seem to be the more common ones that we're familiar with. 3 and 4, maybe not so much. So map number 1 shows Hispanic Americans. Okay. Map number 2 shows African Americans. Map number 3 shows Asian Americans. And map number 4 shows Native Americans. Notice for Hispanic Americans, you see, the darker the color, the more population you have. So for Hispanic Americans, they're located mostly in the south and west, which makes sense because that is where you're going to cross the border from Mexico into the United States, or from pretty much anywhere that they come up through, anywhere in Latin America, right? That border with Mexico is what kind of where you stop first. And so you see a huge concentration right along the border, and then it sort of diminishes as you get further north or further east. African Americans also, if you think about it, it makes sense. African Americans were originally brought to the United States through the slave trade, and slavery was most prolific in the South, working on cotton plantations, tobacco farms, that kind of stuff. And so after the 14th Amendment, after we abolished slavery in the United States, through lots of things, but probably most specifically through a lack of means, there were still a lot of African Americans that stayed in the South, even, generation after generation. It's their home, it's what they know, it's where they feel comfortable. And now that they have more rights and more freedoms being granted to them, or that they finally are getting, what they've deserved all along, kind of thing, you still see a very prominent population of African Americans still in the South. Okay, and that's just that historic holdover. You'll also notice with African Americans and with Latino Americans as well, you kind of see these little dots showing up around different places. These are urban areas. We also find that cities attract a lot more ethnic diversity. People who are coming into the country want to be near other people who are like them. They also want to be near places where they can get a job, where they can go to school, where they can have access to healthcare and education and those kinds of things. And most of that is going to be found in a city. And so we tend to see larger populations of various diverse ethnicities within cities. Okay. This third one is Asian Americans. You'll see it predominantly along the West Coast. Obviously, same thing with Latin America. That's the coast closest to where they are coming from. So that's going to generally be their first stop in the United States. So California up into Washington, that's where we see a lot of Asian Americans who come and settle. The other thing, again, same as with Hispanic Americans and African Americans, lots come into cities, okay, urban areas. And then Native Americans, whole separate concept. Native Americans you're going to find almost exclusively in the West, because when the British came and settled the United States, they settle on the East Coast. They're pushing the Native Americans off their traditional homelands. As the United States becomes a country and then pushes further westward, the whole manifest destiny idea, we continued to push Native Americans further and further west, and we required them to settle in places that were pretty desolate, that we wouldn't have wanted for anything else, places that we wouldn't farm, or places that we wouldn't need to put, huge transportation networks or railways or anything like that. And so we see a huge population of Native Americans in eastern Oklahoma. If you've ever been to Oklahoma, it's a pretty barren place. We see a lot down in the Four Corners area. If you've ever driven through Monument Valley in Utah, there's a big Native American population down there. We also see them here in the Dakotas and Montana, and then up along the border as well. Obviously, and then Alaska, our Native Inuits, and then Hawaii also is going to have Native Hawaiians. Those would be considered part of that Native American group as well. If you look at this map over here, this is a map of Chicago. You will notice that there is some pretty specific division between ethnic groups in the city of Chicago. You'll also notice that there are lots of ethnic groups in the city of Chicago. We talked about how urban areas attract diverse ethnicities. Well, here you go. In Chicago, we've got African Americans, Mexicans, Polish, Irish and Celtic, Puerto Ricans, Germans, Chinese, Italian, white, Russian, Indian, Greek, Indian meaning from India, not Native American, Greek, Assyrian, Ukrainian, and Armenian. Okay. The biggest groups, Mexican are the yellow, okay, yellow pockets. The African American are the blue pockets. Irish here. Irish is the green, go figure. But it's interesting that we talk about how people want to come and they want to settle with other people like them. This is, kind of a bird's eye view zoomed in of one city where that is the case. There's African American neighborhoods, there's Mexican neighborhoods. There really isn't a lot of crossover between the two. They stay fairly, just with other people who are like them. All right. That is the end of our discussion about patterns. Types of diffusion. Some of this is going to be what's the word I'm looking for? Some of it's going to be a review. There we go. A review from what we've done before. Some of it will be a little bit new. Okay. So for our big idea for types of diffusion, the interaction of people contributes to the spread of cultural practices. That just seems very obvious, but let's put it out there. And then our goal for this portion is to define, explain, and provide examples of the types of diffusion. So this is a review. This is a slide straight from Unit 1. Diffusion, to remember, is the connections that happen as things shift, okay, as things move through space. So diffusion is the process by which a feature spreads across space from one place to another over time. There's two main categories of diffusion. The first is relocation diffusion, which happens, due to migration. The spread of a feature idea through the physical movement of people from one place to another. So if you have a large influx of Hispanic population into your town, don't be surprised if you start hearing Latin music played on the radio. Don't be surprised if there's a Mexican restaurant that opens up down the street, right? That kind of idea. Expansion diffusion is the spread of a feature or idea in an additive process, so where you kind of add to it. So relocation is move, expansion is the spread, and we're going to talk about those three categories of expansion diffusion right here. So the first is hierarchical diffusion, the spread of an idea from persons or nodes of authority or power to other persons or places. So this node of authority could be a political person, it could be a celebrity, it could be some sort of expert, it could be a teacher, okay, if we go on a smaller scale, teacher or a parent even. That would be a hierarchical diffusion. Contagious diffusion is the rapid, widespread diffusion of a characteristic throughout the population. This is what, if we talk about something that goes viral, we're talking about contagious diffusion, okay? It starts and then all of a sudden everybody's heard about it, everybody's watched the video, everybody's, seen the reel or whatever it is, okay? All of a sudden everyone has access to it. And then stimulus diffusion is the spread of an underlying principle, even though the characteristic itself fails to spread. So it's the idea of, okay, well, I'm going to make a sandwich that's beef between two pieces of bread and I'm going to put cheese on it. Well, all of a sudden we end up with McDonald's. Well, now we've got McDonald's. Well, Chick-fil-A's got a chicken sandwich, so now McDonald's needs a chicken sandwich, right? So we kind of take this idea and it spreads, but it spreads in a slightly different way than the original idea, okay? Okay, now we're going to talk about both historical causes and contemporary causes of diffusion. So how things used to spread back in the day versus how things spread today. So historical causes of diffusion, our big idea over here is that cultural ideas, practices, and innovations change and or disappear over time. And our goal is to explain how historical processes impact current cultural patterns. Okay, so what happens when cultures meet? The first thing that can happen, and again, this is review straight from Unit 1, these top three, assimilation, where one group's culture features are altered to resemble those of another group. So they, if you have a Hispanic American that comes in and instead of, maintaining their own cultural identity, they learn English, they stop celebrating their traditional holidays, they start wearing clothes that everyone else in their community is wearing. They assimilate into wherever it is they've moved into. Acculturation, changes in culture that result from the meeting of two groups while still maintaining distinct cultural features. So you can kind of be in a new group without losing your identity or losing your cultural and ethnic features that kind of make up who you are. Syncretism is the last one, the combination of two culture groups to form a new culture. Now, we see this through a couple of different things. Creolization is the process of mixing cultural traits, primarily languages. A Creole language is the mixing of a colonizer's language with a colonized people's language. So, for example, the one that I'm thinking of and where the picture comes from over here is when the French actually came in and settled the Louisiana area first. They were the first settlers there, and there was a group of Native Americans down there. Well, the Native Americans and the French kind of end up with this, relationship that isn't necessarily a bad one, but the French settlers, colonizers, wanted the Native Americans to speak French, and so they started teaching them French. Well, the Native Americans wanted to maintain their own language, and so they developed what is basically a Creole French. And so there's some French terms, there's some terms from their original language, and it's sort of become this mesh of the two languages that ends up becoming a whole new, different, separate language. Lingua franca is sort of the same idea, except on a much bigger scale, and there's no meshing. A lingua franca is a language of international communication that's mutually understood across societies. So the lingua franca, the main one, the biggest one in our world right now, is English. English is the predominant lingua franca. So I can live in the United States, I can speak English, but if I go to Europe, everybody there pretty much speaks English. Whether they want to admit it or not, whether they'll speak it to me or not, they speak English. I can go to China and they speak English. I can go to Japan and they speak English. I can go to South America and they speak English. Because it's become this lingua franca, which is this language of international communication, okay, where it's important that people, even if that's not their native language, if they still understand it. English is taught in schools in lots of countries, and it's expected that people become fluent in English, even if that isn't your primary language. So historical causes of diffusion. We're going to talk about English and lingua franca in a minute, some more. So historical causes of diffusion, the way things used to spread, colonial imperialism is the biggest one, where an outside force imposes its culture on, an existing situation. So the picture that I've got with that is this one. This is a picture of the port at Mumbai. Mumbai is in India. It's one of the biggest cities in India. And you'll notice we have this building right here, and this building right here, and this building right here. There are parts of these buildings that look very Indian. Okay, so we've got the little pinnacles on top of the kind of the rounded domes. That's a very Indian style. On this skyscraper in the back, you can see the windows are sort of, they're not squared off. They've got kind of an arched top to them. That's very Indian as well. But this right here, this was built to welcome a British governor who was coming in to govern Mumbai, and this was built as kind of his welcome present to the area. This is very European. This does not look Indian at all. It looks like something you would see in Paris or in London. And so you kind of see this mesh because India has a colonial legacy that includes British rule for decades. The Britons, I think the British were there for over 100 years. And so the Brits come in, they leave an imprint, architecturally, educationally, infrastructure, all of these different things. And you can see that evidence in the cultural landscape. This is another really good example of sequent occupancy as well, because we can see, signs and representations that show us that this is in India, but also, kind of this holdover from when the Brits were there as well. War is another one. War is very similar, has a similar outcome to colonial and imperialism. The difference is that cultural interaction is forced, okay? It isn't people colonizing and coming to stay. It's people coming to take over and to force people to do things. The picture I've got for that one is this picture right here. This is a representation of Japan specifically. Japan for a long time was referred to as the land of the rising sun. You can see the flag of Japan with just the red kind of big circle in the middle, refers to that rising sun idea. But for a long time, from the middle 1800s all the way through World War II, the Japanese Empire continued to spread. It spread through the Korean Peninsula, it spread down through Southeast Asia, all the way down into Australia, and even up into a pretty significant part of China. And Japan's military force in taking over all of these places and adding them to the empire resulted in a lot of Japanese traditions and cultural architecture, cultural religion, all of those kinds of pieces get integrated into these other places. My stylus. There we go. And so Japan is a really good example of spreading culture by force. Another really good example of spreading culture by force is actually the Islamic religion. Early in their history, there was a lot of proselyting of the early Muslims. And that proselyting resulted in a lot of, okay, you can join my church or I'm going to kill you. It was sort of like conversion by sword. And so that would be another good example of this diffusion by war idea. The third one is migration, which obviously makes sense. We've talked about relocation migration already. But this is my little symbol for migration, right? You go from one place to another and you take your culture with you and then you influence the new place you settle. This picture right here this is a restaurant, an Ethiopian restaurant. It's in New York City. New York City is about as far from Ethiopia as you can get, and yet there are places where you can go and you can have a traditional Ethiopian meal because of this migration idea, right? Ethiopians migrated from their country to New York City or somewhere else, right? And have since opened an Ethiopian restaurant. And then the last one is trade. Trading new products from other cultures. So this, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this to work. Maybe I'll take a minute and show this to you guys next time. But if you've ever seen the movie Ever After, it's an older movie. It came out late 90s. There's a scene where, so Ever After is the Cinderella story. There's a scene where the prince and this woman, her name is Marguerite, they're kind of walking through the town's marketplace, and he's given like a bowl, and he gives her a piece of what's in the bowl, and she's like, here, or he's like, here, try this. And so she tries it, and she's like, what is this? This is delicious. And he's like, it's chocolate. The Spanish monks keep sending bricks of it. Well, if you think about chocolate, chocolate originated about 4,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. Okay, so Mexico, South America area. And through Spanish colonialism, chocolate was taken to Spain. And from there, it was further diffused through Europe. And so this movie is set in what is present day England. And the prince is tasting chocolate that came from Spain and originally from like Mesoamerica. And so because of this trade piece, chocolate ends up in Europe. All right, so we talked about the historical causes, all of the things that used to happen in order for cultural ideas to spread, right? Colonialism or imperialism, war, migration, and trade. Next one. These are contemporary causes of diffusion. And now we're going to talk about contemporary causes, things that are going on now, okay? Things that are happening now to continue the spread of these cultural traits. So our big idea over here is that cultural ideas, practices, and innovations change or disappear over time. And now we're going to explain how historical processes, so the things that we just talked about, impact our current cultural patterns. So modern cultural diffusion, if we think about it, culture is a social contract, okay? It's something that we socially design for ourselves. So as our society changes, our culture is going to change too. Large-scale processes include globalization and urbanization. Small-scale processes for these changes include urbanization as well, but on a smaller scale. So if we just look locally, okay, instead of globally. Toponyms, other things that would be considered small-scale would just be anything you could see evident like in your town or your state. The effects of these processes are evident through all kinds of things. We see society changing by ways of media, technology, politics, economics, and social relationships. But remember, scale matters. So whether we're talking local or we're talking global, we're still going to see changes, but it might look different depending on the scale you're looking at. Communication technologies is a big one. If I were to put a big asterisk, know this one. The internet is huge. And space-time convergence technologies both contribute to the modern day diffusion of culture. Probably the biggest impact. By reshaping and accelerating interactions among people, changing cultural practices. For example, one of those changes in cultural practices are the increasing use of English, which leads to the loss of these indigenous, local, folk, ethnic languages. And then the creating of cultural divergence or convergence. Okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. For space-time convergence, again, this is a review from Unit 1. You may or may not remember, but space-time convergence is anything that happens that allows you to do something faster than you used to be able to do it. Okay? Places and people are getting closer together, and the reason for that is through technology, improved, faster technologies. We see it most specifically with transportation. Okay, so here I've got a light rail train and a plane, right? If I used to need to travel from Utah to London, it was going to take me a couple of weeks to go over land, and then it was going to take me a couple of months to go over sea to get to London. But now I can hop a plane in Salt Lake and I can be in London in 11 hours. Okay. Much, much faster time period than it used to take. And then communication as well. I always talk about so there's a battle in the Civil War. It's the Battle of Palmito Ranch. It happens in Texas. And it actually happens after the war had ended. But because communication technology at the time was so slow, it took people, longer for word to get to the far reaches of the different armies to let them know that the war was over and they didn't need to fight anymore. Now, all I have to do is pull my phone out and send a quick tweet, and everyone in the world can read it. It's so much faster, which is good and bad, right? We tend to be a lot more, flippant, I guess, about what we say, because things change so quickly that it doesn't really matter. Nothing seems permanent. Whereas before, if I knew that it was going to take 3 weeks for my letter to be delivered, I maybe would have been more specific in what I said and what I included, and, been more diligent to write well and all of those kinds of things, because it was a bigger deal than it is now. This idea of cultural divergence versus cultural convergence, what that means. So cultural divergence is when people leave their culture or abandon certain elements of it, okay? So if this is their culture in the middle, they are going away from it. Cultural convergence is where people start to have one mass culture. Both of these things are happening, okay? They can happen simultaneously. So this idea that we're going to start from all of these different places, all these different cultures, all these different ethnicities, and as we come together through these kind of global processes, globalization, urbanization, etc., we're going to end up with the same thing. We're going to end up in the same place. Both convergence and divergence are the result of globalization and the improvement in communication technologies, and often result in the loss of unique cultures or cultural attributes. Now, it's at this point where we really need to have a word of caution. We talk about the loss of unique cultural attributes because of this kind of push toward a global society. Well, there really is a battle going on between globalization and unique local culture. If the world does not recognize and prioritize the importance of local culture, such as indigenous languages is a good example, those cultures will be lost, and we will end up with one mass culture fueled by the force of globalization. Now, I am not making a judgment on this. I'm not saying that this is good or bad. Maybe if I were in a different position where some of these local cultural attributes applied more specifically to me, I would have a different opinion. But I don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing if we end up as one mass culture. I think it would be sad. I think we would lose a lot of the diversity that makes life and places so unique and so inspiring and so fun to visit. But I don't know that there's anything innately bad about it, if that makes sense. But you guys can make that judgment for yourselves. The last thing we're going to talk about is a little more specifics on the English language, because this is a really good example of that whole idea of one mass global culture. The prevalence of English is taking over worldwide. Okay, we talked about how it's already a lingua franca. Because English is so prevalent, and I list a few different things where you see it, it's kind of taking over places where they may have had some indigenous language or some ethnic language, and now all of a sudden new generations that have more access to technology and communications, English is the language that's being used, and so those younger generations are adopting that rather than learning their original ethnic language. And so when we look and see that English is what's prominent on the internet, English is what's being used for international trade and business, English is what's being used in international entertainment with Hollywood, US celebrities, Netflix, all of that kind of stuff, it's all English. And English is what we see on social media, and as that social media gets published to a wider audience than just the United States, it's still in English. And then now with the development of the United States and the wealth that we have in our country, there's lots of people who are touring other places in the world and they speak English. And it's a lot easier for them to go other places that also speak English. And so that economic piece, that money piece, where we want English tourists to come to our country, so maybe we should make it easier for them to do that. And, you know, we'll teach English to our kids in our schools, and they'll use English, you know, in their conversations, and they'll have access to English programming and social media and internet and all that kind of stuff. It comes at a cost. So the spread of English is actually limiting, and in some cases taking over those original those original ethnic languages. Okay. All right, that's it for the day. I feel like I spoke a really long time, and I apologize, but it got us through a whole lot of content, and we just didn't have time to not do it in class. So if you had questions, I hope you jot them down. We'll go over them in class on Monday, and finish your cultural landscape project. It's in Canvas as well, and be nice to the sub. Okay, I will see you guys Monday. Take care.